in Congress that are watching out and are understanding and really working through the issues and understand how dynamic the area is that we're in. The concept behind the bill is to really sort out regulation, who's going to regulate what in the world as we go forward. Because right now, for me, it's not so unclear. For a lot of other people, it's unclear. But they're trying to bring, I think, a greater level of clarity to what bucket we're going to put these different kinds of tokens. The bottom line here is, if you think that you've got a token, you want a token offering, and you're not going to be regulated, shall I say, think again? If it's not a security, and everybody wants to get their security out of, or their token out of being a security, they want it to be a commodity. They want it to be a utility token. You move it into the category utility token, and it's going to end up in some other regulator's hands. Today it will. I'm just always amazed. Everybody says, mine's a utility token. I said, yes, but do you know what your regulatory obligations are around a utility token? Oh, there's none. It's not a security, so the SEC is not going to bug me about it. Nope, that's not right. I've been in the area of what we call prepaid. Prepaid cards, gift cards, for a lot of years, and I know the laws on both the federal level and the state level, and what I can tell you is you move yourself outside of a security, you're moving yourself into something else. And a lot of the utility tokens are definitely forms of prepaid if you listen to what the arguments are that are being made with respect to the utility tokens. And if they're not that, well, then this issue around commodities becomes very confusing too. And everybody says, well, if it's a commodity, then it's a CFTC. And they've been a lot nicer because they've had this innovations lab. They've been way ahead of the curve, and they've been speaking the right kind of language of being a federal regulator that's really interested in trying to help the industry. Well, you know, it's some interesting issues jurisdictionally with the CFTC, and that's why when you read here, it's going to seek clarification in a second bill on what is a commodity. Because guess what? If it's a commodity, if there's manipulation in the price of that commodity, the CFTC now may not regulate the commodity itself, but the CFTC can regulate trading in that commodity. And that's what is at issue with the, going back a year ago. Yes, sir.
No, so we've got the SEC and the CFTC basically saying we want to regulate. I mean, what happens when you have the two of those agencies fighting over governing?
Well, okay, so I don't have the chart up here to help sort through all of that, because we don't just stop with this, and that's another mistake a lot of people make, is to say it's the SEC or it's the CFTC, and that's where the world ends. Because we also have the CFPB and the FTC who come in from a consumer protection side. So let's say you have something that is really unique. You know, it is a utility token that may not be a form of prepaid. You know, pay in advance for use of services of that issuer at some point in the future. That defines a lot of the utility tokens that are being put out there. But let's say it's not, that it's a network effect type of a situation. For whatever reason, it can find its own place. You still have regulators, even at the federal level, that'll be watching over that. So you'll have the Federal Trade Commission, you'll have the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, who are looking out for the consumer interests there. Are you advertising openly and honestly? Not in any way defrauding the consumer with representations that are being made. And God knows that early forms of representations around a lot of the ICOs could be faulted on multiple levels. So even if we could clear, we didn't have the SEC jurisdiction there, the CFTC, we still have others. And I'll leave out, I won't even go to the banking regulators at this point, because they have sort of what I would call a de facto regulation. So, whoops. So as I said earlier, I've got a list here of some of the key congressmen. On the Senate side, there are a couple of senators that are starting to sort of warm up to this. We have seen some hearings in the past, especially in the Homeland Security area, defense issues with respect to this in the Senate. But most of the activity to date's been over on the House side. And I don't know, hopefully all of you have been to Washington before, so when I say on one side or the other, the House is on one side of the Capitol Hill and the Senate's on the other side of the Capitol Hill. Yes, sir.
Congress is pro-blockchain, pro-rules, and they don't actually talk about blockchain, they just talk about crypto. Are they actually focusing on the distinctions and how each would be regulated differently, if at all?
Okay, so I would say that the last 3-4 years has been spent by the industry in trying to help educate members of Congress on this. And I've got another slide where I mentioned the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, which is a group of the congressmen who have come together and have been meeting with these outside groups on a very regular basis. Coin centers played a huge role in putting forth information and meeting and educating members of Congress. Because right now, and we will probably continue to be in an education state for the next year at least or more, because the knowledge base of what's happening in the world of crypto on Capitol Hill is really still very down here. These are the standouts. These are the congressmen and women who are a little bit further up on that scale than others. I got to conduct an interview. I had a conference in Washington about 3 weeks ago called Block Change, and we had Congressman Schweikert and Congressman Davidson who spoke, and I got to do a personal interview with Schweikert afterwards. And I was, to be honest with you, I was blown away with how deep his understanding was, and his comment to me was, he says, you know, I live in Arizona, and I have a lot of long trips back and forth to Washington that I get a lot of reading done. But plus he also has a tech background. The asterisks that I put up there are now the 4 co-chairs of the Blockchain Caucus. So these are going to be the people to watch on the House side. Now, what's important to note is that just because these people are leaders in the caucus doesn't mean that they necessarily have appropriate standing in the House of Representatives overall to be particularly effective. However, the fact that they've gotten themselves to a leadership role means they're probably more effective than most are. So that's an important piece to keep in mind, is where do these people sit vis-a-vis the power structure in the House so that they're going to actually be able to get something done. So, you know, it's one thing, I mean, there are lots of Congress people who have been in Congress for a long time that may not be particularly effective. And what you know, if we're looking at meaningful change, you want to look to who's going to be effective. And in fact, at the conference I had, Congressman Soto was also supposed to speak. But at the very last minute, as he was getting in the car to come to our event to speak, he got called away because he was called to a House leadership meeting, which means he's in the circle of leaders in the House, which gives him better opportunity to push forward on items that may be on his agenda. Okay, so this year, another great thing about Congress is that when one Congress ends, which it ends every 2 years, they last for 2 years, you have to reintroduce any legislation you want to have considered in that next Congress. So anything that was introduced last year, including Congressman Davidson's bill, that HR or whatever it was on the earlier slide, he introduced that on December 18th. And you sort of scratch your head and say, why would he introduce something on December 18th, knowing that the Congress is going to end on January 2nd, and he's just going to have to reintroduce it again? Why? Well, in his case, and this is what he told me, and his staff said, they wanted to get the bill out there. They wanted people to start looking at it, start thinking about the different issues that he's raised in it, and start providing feedback. They will reintroduce that bill, which is a lot longer than the 2 bills that are up here. It's about 11 or 12 or 13 pages and covers 6, 7, 8 different issues. But they put it out as a trial balloon. And so and again, you should be taking a look at it now and seeing what your feelings are about it and talking to, you know, any people that you feel like talking to. We can talk about how to make that effective. But But, be looking at that now. He's got provisions in there to deal with tax. He's got provisions to deal in there with definition of tokens. He has, as I said, about 6 or 7 different areas. He has one provision in there that, in my mind, having it in that bill will kill the bill. That bill will never see the light of day. Okay, so what do we have right now? We have 2 bills that are calling for studies. Remember what I said? You can't pass the legislation, or you don't want to get it passed right now. The easiest thing to do is go ask for a study. So one of them would have the CFTC looking at price manipulation and how, what kind of regulatory structures need to make recommendations on how to protect against manipulation of prices in the crypto market. The second is looking at general regulation of cryptocurrencies and how do we keep the U.S. competitive in a world that's increasingly expanding, opening up to crypto ventures. And so the CFTC is the one, it will work with other agencies, but it's the one that's directed to undertaking this. And then they want recommendations on competitiveness. What's the timing on these bills? I don't think these bills in and of themselves are particularly controversial, but they still have to be passed. So that's what's coming. What has happened is back about a week and a half ago, we got a bill passed out of the House. Now, remember, we have a bicameral system, which means we've got to have both the House and the Senate approve it before it gets sent to the President. The chances of this legislation coming up before the Senate anytime soon is not clear. The other 2, not clear. But what the one that has passed it's called the FIND Act. If you look at it, fight illicit networks and detect trafficking Act of 2019. What it is to study the use of cryptos for sex, facilitating sex, and for drug trafficking. Let's just say that kind of piece of legislation isn't the best thing to help crypto along the way. Okay, so that's what we've got on the horizon right now. Okay, I just want to say who to watch. As I said, Blockchain Caucus, we've talked about the members who are going to be most influential. There's this new Democrat Technology Task Force that's been set up. And Congressman Soto, remember, he's one of the caucus leaders. He's a co-leader of that task force. Pay attention to trade associations, but make sure you understand who those trade associations are and what those trade associations stand for, okay? That's absolutely critical, because you'll see on my next slide is when you start to talk about spending your money, you need to really make sure you look under the, make sure you look very carefully, do your due diligence before you, jump ahead. We're seeing a proliferation of trade associations right now. I have a couple that I think are going to, sort of be long-term survivors and very effective in Washington, like the Blockchain Association, which has been set up by some of the very major players in the crypto space, as well as a couple of others. So there's going to be trade association groups within the crypto and blockchain community, and there are trade associations that are more traditional trade associations that are adding, if not focus groups or study groups or whatever right now, but will make this area more significant as time goes on. The other is to watch out for watch and look, pay attention to the efforts of individual companies. Who's hiring their own sets of lobbyists in Washington? You should always, anyone who's got a really serious issue to deal with, you need to have a group around you, but you also have to have somebody who's watching out for your own individual interest. But again, make sure you spend wisely on that front. So what do? I would say get involved. I mean, if you're here, you want to learn something, you want to hear about it. We're in early stages. We're not going to have the end-all legislation that you're looking for right now to solve the problems of the industry. What is happening in Wyoming? Hopefully all of you are paying some attention to what's going on in Wyoming. It's an interesting experiment, but what I can say right now, it's pretty much of an experiment. They are going to craft some legislation that will eventually make its way around to other states and maybe eventually to the federal level. but it's going to be pretty darn limited to, if you want some relief, you know, whatever impact, you're going to have to be in the state of Wyoming, and it's going to be pretty much within the borders of Wyoming. It's not going to help you in your interaction. It's not going to resolve your issues elsewhere around the world. So learn the process, learn how all this happens. You know, who are the key players, as I said, establish relationships. Now is the time to be building relationships, especially if you're, you know, you have a company and you've got some issues that are going to be coming ahead. And then get ahead of those issues, because you don't want to have you don't want to be hit with an issue like with what Google and Facebook and so on have had to deal with of late. You don't want to have those hitting you in the face and not have relationships in Washington and not have a foundation laid for your issues ahead of time. And as I said, if you're in a business, it's safety in numbers. You know, you want some others around you, and spend your money wisely in this process. So hopefully that's helpful to you. I think the biggest takeaway here is, I said, we don't have a panacea ahead of us on the regulatory or on the legislative front. If you think that that's going to, the answer to your problems, your issues is going to happen on the federal level, you're going to have to start holding your breath, and you're going to be holding it for a long time. Yes, sir.
What do you think is driving some of the efforts in Washington? Is it lawmakers that are looking to make changes, or to protect against the move of crypto to take over, for example? Is it a matter of fear? Is it a matter of opportunities? Is it Amazon, Google, large players funding a lot of this to look into, future use cases?
I can tell you it's not Google and Facebook. They're spending their money in Washington in other ways right now. It's not blockchain. I think that probably a driving force, and I think that had we not gone into, well, the ICOs definitely had an impact. I think had we not gone into a crypto winter, my guess is that you would have a lot more people in Congress involved right now than they were a year ago, and that's because they're looking at the money. They're looking at where there's this new wealth created, and they want to tap into that wealth creation. So that's why you had people starting to jump on this bandwagon of crypto, because suddenly there's a whole new class of donors out there. Campaign contributors we can go get. It's a cynical view, but it's a very honest view. So that's part of the reason driving some of the early players into it, is that they recognized early that this is going to be important. I think there's another interesting thread through here, is that several of these players, Congressman Davidson, for example, I think is a graduate of West Point. That these congressmen, congresswomen are coming out with tech backgrounds, and they understand, they're a little bit ahead of the game in understanding what it is that we're on the verge of here. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to move into and talk about AML, KYC, and sanctions. How many of you have heard of the Petro coin? Good. How many of you saw that just a couple days ago, the announcement, would you mind bringing the other one, about the, a company just, it wasn't Chainalysis, it was another one, that an Israeli company, I believe, that had discovered a couple of Hamas wallets, and that funds were flowing from, I think, Coinbase into the Hamas wallet. Now, to your point, I'm going to tie the legislation together right now. That's the kind of stuff that's going to get the attention of Congress onto this community. Is that when you get those kinds of reports, and remember they did get that 412 to whatever it was votes, the resolution to do the study, that was only focused on sex and drugs, and not on terrorism. But if anything gets people in Washington worked up faster than anything else, if you want that fire that you've got to go fight, terrorism is it.
Aren't they finding that the people using these wallets, using cryptocurrency in terrorism, are much easier to find,
You know, the problem is that the value is often before you can detect it. You know, it takes time to detect after the transaction has happened and put the analysis together. If you're really doing it real time and you know that's a Haas wallet and you see the money going to it, yeah, that's helpful. But the problem is most of this is found on the backside. And you know, the real pressure is to, or the impetus is to put the pressure on the industry to look for it up front so that it never happens in the first place. Because once it goes, it's gone, the value. So that's the issue that we're up against. So, and I'd like to welcome Brandon Mintz, who is going to join me in giving you a little bit of view of the industry on these issues. But I sort of thought I would start with a true-false here. Okay.
I can explain how I got into all this.
Okay, let me do this first and then I'll, okay. Okay, so first of all, anti-money, AML means anti-money laundering, and KYC, they're the same thing. True or false? False. Okay, why is it false?
Know your customer.
It's know your customer.
Well, you have to have an AML policy that embodies your KYC.
Ah, so KYC is part of AML. But my favorite comment, and I can't tell you how many ICOs that I've talked to that said, oh, I've done my KYC, so I'm AML compliant. So they think that AML and KYC are the beginning and the end. Okay, so does any of this apply? True or false? That none of this applies to the crypto blockchain community? AML, KYC. Anybody want to say it's true? Okay. Well, then maybe my test today won't be so hard. Okay, how about if I collect information about the customer, I've done my AML. We sort of just answered that. So if you've done it, is that all you need to do? I should have waited on that one. Well, again, a lot of people think that once they've collected the information, that's the starting point. You collect the information, then what do? You've got to review that information. You look at your transactions. You look through the whole process of the activity that's happening around a customer. It is really, truly just the starting point. And, you know, and I've seen this with the banks over and over again, is that pardon me. This is what I always say. That's why I'm a lawyer and not a tech person. Okay, I don't need to collect information if that amounts below $3,000. Is that true or false? I don't have to do any KYC. False. How about 500? If it's at 500, do I have to collect any information? Do you have to collect some? Well, if you're in the category of money service business, in fact, you don't have to. There's no legal requirement to do so. However, you've got to have a reasonable and effective program for compliance, and if you don't collect it, you can't possibly have one. Okay. Yeah, what did I can limit the transactional value, true or false, and then I don't need to worry about any of this compliance. I can't tell you how often that's, oh, I'm going to keep it at 500, or I'm going to make it 3,000, or I'll make it 10,000. You know, that way I don't have to worry about any of that compliance. Okay. Once I've checked the list, what list am I talking about? OFAC list, the sanctions list. Once I've checked the list, I've complied with the sanctions laws. True or false? This is a hard one. True? False? Well, let's see what the next one says, because I think the next one is related. Whoops. Okay, yeah, sort of related. So all prohibited persons are on the OFAC list. The people I can't do business with are on the OFAC list. True or false? False. Why? Because OFAC has a whole host of, it has laws, it has regulations, it's got executive orders. And take Cuba, for example. I guess Iran's a better one. We can't do business with everybody in Iran. However, not everybody in Iran's on the OFAC list. So checking the list, you know, is not it's not the end of compliance or attempts to comply, it's just the beginning. which that in and of itself on multiple levels presents a lot of issues. Okay, how about all of this applies only when I'm in the US? True or false? Hey, you guys are getting too good here. If you are a US person, which means if you're a US citizen, a resident, so a green card, or visiting the United States, you're subject to the regime. If you're a US citizen, these laws apply to you wherever you are in the world. And oh, by the way, they apply to the company that you own. So, you know, taking your ICO to Singapore or to Malta or someplace else is not going to get you out from under compliance with the sanctions regime. Okay, so is the U.S. only the U.S. has these crazy laws, true or false? Okay, that's yes. We are seeing that. We know that there are a number of other countries that follow the same sanctions regimes that we do. This is my favorite. I only write code, so none of this applies to me. True. In your dreams. No, I think that. Yes, sir.
Is that last one true if you're a contractor?
So you've been contracted by someone to write code for them that's going to then violate the laws. And do you know when you're writing the code that it's going to violate the laws?
I mean, I would assume you don't. You just contractors.
Well, knowledge is an important issue. And then the question is, how much should you know? Are you just being willfully blind because they're going to pay you a lot of money and you're just not going to ask any questions about what they're doing? That can get you into trouble too. But we do have a case, Liberty Reserve, 2013, and it wasn't sanctions, but it was anti-money laundering, where the CTO and an information management person both went to jail because they wrote code and administered a system for someone that had created the system to violate law.
Does that play into the duty of doing due diligence as a contractor to make sure that you are in compliance with this? Is that their responsibility, their duty? Tying into his question about what if you're a contractor and none of this applies to you? Should you find out whether it applies to you?
Let's assume the law applies to you. What you need to do is just make sure you understand the project you're working on and what it's going to do. Now, I can tell you there's a particular person, I remember meeting him for the first time in Amsterdam, probably 2014, and he has an infamous coin, and he said, well, it's my First Amendment rights. I can write it however I want to. Well, I was having the conversation with the guy who was saying, hey, none of this applies to me. But I also was having conversations with members of the people in the prosecutorial community who were very actively working to try and indict this person.
So can you clarify, was it because they wrote the code and operated it, or was it because writing the code was part of it? It'll be a totality of circumstances that'll be looked at, so it's what's your level of involvement. So you may not be, in the case of Liberty Reserve, the CTO wasn't an owner or founder, but the CTO wrote code knowing how that code was going to be used, and it was going to be used for bad purposes. Is that what happened with Ether Delta? Are you familiar with that situation?
Yeah. Now, Ether Delta has not been prosecuted criminally. That was an action that was taken by the SEC. So it's a different set of laws that we're looking at. But, and in that case, really the SEC just took the position it's really not decentralized. There's a there. Somebody's maintaining the website, somebody's writing the code for it. I believe it was the CFTC commissioner recently who made a very pointed statement that got picked up in the press saying, if you write the code, you're going to be held liable. Now, FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, does take the view that if you write the code for something that becomes an ICO, people have not pursued the free speech issue. If I had to gamble on free speech, if you knew what was going to happen down the way, maybe you're exercising free speech, but you were also, engaging in money laundering or whatever Well, you know, the bottom line is that, and this goes into ethics, and I don't know how many, if any of you have ever attended the Texas Bitcoin conference, but it was organized by Linda and Paul Snow. Paul Snow is one of the founders of Factum, and I spent some time with Linda Snow this weekend at Satoshi Roundtable, and she and I had this conversation around ethics, and that the need now is to really get some ethics training into this community so that people have an understanding. You just can't go, you should, well, you can if you want to, but you shouldn't be just writing code just for the sake of writing the code. And I know a lot of engineering and computer sci programs. I know University of Virginia, for example, has a very vibrant program bringing the ethics into the development of the technology. So we diverged, but I think this is an incredibly important point. Okay, thank God I only did an ICO, and I did KYC AML, so I don't have anything to worry about, right? I can go home. Well, what FinCEN said just about this time last year, they sent a letter to a senator. This is the other side, a little more powerful than the congressman. And they sent a letter to the senator saying, hey, if you write the code for something that becomes the coin that gets issued in an ICO, and you take money, you take something of value, can be crypto, can be fiat, or it could be something else, and you do that, you're a money service business under the Bank Secrecy Act, and you have to register as such, and that means you then become subject to a lot of the compliance we're going to talk about. Okay, so real quickly, I've been throwing a lot of terms around. What's KYC? What's AML? Anti-money laundering versus KYC. Anti-money laundering, we have two sets of statutes basically we look at in the United States. One are the federal criminal statutes that say, thou shalt not be engaged in the act of laundering the proceeds of illegal activity or helping to finance or provide support to money to terrorists. You're also not supposed to be aiding and abetting in that activity, and willfully blind. And we talked a little bit about the willfully blind concept, but you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to be the one who's actually taking the money to get it cleaned. You're not supposed to be the one on the other side who's taking that money, knowing the money's come from an illegal activity. And you're not supposed to say, well, don't ask, don't tell. That doesn't work. That's one set of laws. That applies to every one of us in the room, regardless of what you're doing, what your activity is. If you're a coder, it applies to you. Whether you're a money service business or not, it applies to you. The second set of laws, the Bank Secrecy Act. That's a set of laws, well, first of all, if you have a foreign bank account, it applies to you regardless of what else. But there's a whole set of record-keeping and reporting requirements that apply if you're what we call a financial institution. And a financial institution for this purpose includes a currency exchange or cryptocurrency exchanger, certain other players in the crypto sphere that doesn't, right now, if you want to ask a big change that'll come in Congress, that's one that will come as potentially miners. Mining's not covered. However, if you do that ICO, remember, you probably have triggered the Bank Secrecy Act as well. Bear with me for a second. And then there's the state laws. Okay? And the state laws, some of them mirror the federal laws, but you have those to deal with. Who regulates the Bank Secrecy Act? It's FinCEN and Financial Crimes Enforcement Network that makes the rules and enforces them. The IRS is the one. If you are doing anything in the crypto space, the IRS can come in on a moment's notice and examine you. And if you haven't complied with all the things you have to in the Bank Secrecy Act, they can penalize you and you can potentially go to jail for that. The Department of Justice is the one who will look over violations of the money laundering statutes. So BTCE, for example, got indicted which is the foreign exchange, that's layered at multiple levels, but DOJ indicted. Criminal prosecution and FinCEN came after them for violations of the Bank Secrecy Act. Sanctions. On the sanctions side, I've already told you a number of things here is that one, OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, it is an office. It does exist. It makes regulations. It enforces the regulations, and it does definitely penalize people. It has the designated, the SDN list. It also has a broader sanctions type list now, bringing together other sanctions programs in other parts of the government. And the important element, in my conference I had a session calling OFAC Awakens Crypto Industry, because for the first time ever, back in late November, early December, it put wallet addresses on the list for the first time. Now, what's tricky about compliance in this area is it applies not only to the individual who's on that list, that prohibition you can't do business with, it also applies to anyone who is owned or controlled by that person, who is acting for or on behalf of that person and is otherwise associated. So let's take the Petro coin and Mr. Maduro, President Maduro. President Maduro is on the OFAC list and he's covered. His wife, who is closely associated with him as a relative, is covered. I think she may be on it now herself. And if he were to have a mistress, the mistress would also be covered. That's how it extends itself. The fines are real. We have seen it applied in digital currency, and I also use PayPal up there because PayPal got hit with a $7 million fine for doing about $700,000 of transactions with somebody who was on the SDN list. It did, when you run the numbers against that 7,000, it did an average $57 a piece, the transaction. There is no de minimis level. If you do the crime, you do the time. And the other piece is OFAC is looking very, very closely at this thing. If you walk away out of here today with nothing else in mind, is that OFAC is out there and they are aggressively observing and acting on what's happening in this community right now because it is a huge, huge threat for them. Yes, sir.
So I know we talk a lot about ICOs and how that plays in, but I think one of the biggest questions here too is, you know, in the dream of Bitcoin, every business you pay for it, or whatever currency it is, you pay with it. So one of the reasons that money service transmitters are usually targeted by these regulations is because they can cast a wide net over, you know, doing these regulations, AML, KYC. But imagine that every business directly accepted Bitcoin. You know, is the onus on the business? You know, if there's no payment service provider that exists, you know, is the business targeting for doing KYC and AML things?
Well, let me describe. I hired once a gentleman out of the White House who was at the White House working on terrorist issues on 9/11. And when he joined me a few years later and we started doing some work on the OFAC side, he scratched his head one day and he said, well, yeah, I've never really totally read through all this. If I do what it really says, it means that if I'm selling a hamburger at a McDonald's, I have to check everybody who buys a hamburger to make sure I'm not providing material support to a terrorist. You know, if that's the last meal or if that meal sustains that terrorist. So the bottom line is that it's really an obligation of all persons. No transactions or dealings is the way the language is written. What we have done historically is put the burden on the financial services industry to do that. But again, we're in uncharted waters here.
Yeah, there's a big question then about, is KYC AML a feature that businesses pay for from payment service providers? You know, and if so or if not, how does that apply to, again, Bitcoin, and the difference between payment service providers helping you accept Bitcoin or accepting it directly yourself?
Yeah, well, I mean, if the question is that where's that money coming from is an issue, but what are they buying and why are they buying it? So it's the issues are merged together. So why do you have to check the list if somebody's walking in to buy cold? Well, I was going to say cold syrup. That may not be the best choice, but buy
something very simple, maybe some ice cream. Yeah, haircut, ice cream, whatever. Right. Are those things that you shouldn't be doing? Does it mean because you're using Bitcoin that you've got to check it? But what I can tell you is the reason that the banks all went cold last year, back in that springtime awakening period, is that I think at that point there was increased concerns about mining and where the mining was happening in Bitcoin. So it was North Korea, it was Iran. And if they allowed you to transfer your money to Coinbase, and Coinbase went out and got the Bitcoin to service your request, it could be, or Coinbase or any other exchange, it could be that they were getting coins that had been mined in Iran. And the banks didn't want that on them because we've seen, there's one case in particular I know of where in OFAC land, you're not supposed to have any transactions or dealings with someone on the list. There were 17 different parties that were involved in bringing something to fruition. It was a shipment of oil. Only 2 or 3 of those parties touched the money. People were doing other things in that transaction, and all 17 of them got penalized. So, gentleman back there.
What level of certainty do these regulators require? Because when you're dealing with Bitcoin, there's so many workarounds. Like if I'm dealing with traditional currencies, it's pretty easy to check if it's coming from Iran because they first do it bank. But when you're dealing with Bitcoin, there's so many workarounds you can do to pretend like you're not from Iran. So what level of burden is that? Because you can't do it 100%.
Right.
You can't prevent it.
I got you. It's a reasonable effort. But the question is, how far do you have to go in ascertaining that wallet address? To whom does that wallet address belong? I will tell you, there's low-hanging fruit with respect to a bunch of the Iranians, because I've seen it too many times now in different exchanges and business models. The Iranians are desperate to have a link into financial systems, and they'll go wherever the weakest link is, and they'll hit you from day one coming in. So then the question, but for this Hamas situation, don't have any idea right now. I haven't seen all the information of how many different wallets it may have passed through. And yes, you're right. You can do all sorts of things to hide the trail. We're in an arms race, to be very honest with you, to try to keep up with the changing technologies. But OFAC is looking and it's observing. It's asking a lot of questions about the programs that companies have to be able to do this.
So would you say that if there are, let's say, 3 different companies all transmitting the Bitcoin from A to B for acceptance or whatnot, if someone has the most stringent KYC requirements but it's still not perfect and something does slip through the cracks, is this still zero tolerance from OFAC? Or they can say, okay, at least you're better than the competitors.
If you're really doing, you're doing everything you possibly can given the state of the current technology, and it gets through, stuff happens. I mean, and I can't say that you're going to get a pass or not, but they will look at totality of circumstances. That's been my experience in dealing with them. However, I can say that if you've got a program and all you're asking for collecting at the initial point of contact to do a transaction, and say you have a limit, I'll do it up to $500 or whatever it is, and I'm just collecting, say, a phone number, maybe you're freezing the IP address. If you have a problem, that's not going to get you out of trouble. 4 minutes, did you say? 4 minutes. And Brandon wants to talk. Wait, are we done or we got 4 minutes?
We got 4 minutes to 2 o'clock.
Okay.
So Brandon, you want to talk to Doug?
Answer some of the questions.
Go ahead. So Brandon, well, just tell him what you're doing.
So I found out yesterday, Carol's like, you might as well come up here. I am someone in real life who has to follow all of these annoying laws. I'm one of Carol's former clients before she started the consulting group. I started a company called Cash to Crypto, where in college it was basically me and a laptop and a friend of mine, and we were doing hundreds of thousands of dollars in transactions every month for cash. And I didn't know about any of these laws. So I was the classic example of somebody who just starts this business because it makes money, it's Bitcoin, I'm interested, it's fun. And then I get hit like a brick wall of all of these things going on. And when I met Carol, I had a good understanding, but a good understanding and some procedures in place is not good enough. You have to be basically perfect. So right now I own Bitcoin Depot. It is a crypto ATM company with 200 locations around the US, and we've had to do all of this stuff, compliance program, a yearly audit, and everything like that. And it is pretty scary at times because, for example, when I met Carol, I was in this trading group for local Bitcoins traders. It's a peer-to-peer marketplace. And I think there was about 20 people in the group, and we would just communicate about regulations and scams and whatnot. And in the 3 years I've known Carol, 2 of those 20 have been sentenced to prison for not being licensed as a money transmitter or not collecting information on customers. And for example, that true-false question that we saw earlier, where it said you don't have to collect any information from anyone who gives you less than $3,000. Well, the thing is, in this space, the regulators, they just like to give you very general guidelines. They don't give you a clear yes or a no. And the reason why they do that is they allow a very gray area so they can come after you if they want. So even though it may say $3,000, which is a guidance from 2014 from FinCEN, you have to collect information, you're really expected to not allow anonymous transactions. For example, let's say you don't collect any information on somebody who puts in $100 into your machine. 2 months later, you get a call and they say, you know, this person was on the OFAC list. They were funding this terrorist operation in the Middle East. Do you think if they come knocking and they say, hey, did you collect information on this person? And you say, well, you know, the FinCEN guidance says I don't need anything under $3,000, that you're going to be okay. No, you're probably going to go to prison. There's going to be some huge fine. Your business is going to be shut down. So I've had to go through all of this stuff on a daily basis. It hasn't been fun, but I've learned a lot, and now luckily I've delegated a lot of this to a full-time compliance officer, which is one of the requirements of FinCEN's 4 pillars. So I guess we're probably out of time here, but if anyone has questions for me, because I've been through this in real life, just let me know. Okay.
Both of us will be around outside, so we'd happy to entertain things. Just want to let you know, I'm actually coming down to Atlanta probably late in March, and then we're going to have some to do an AML compliance boot camp. It'll be AML and sanctions boot camp for virtual currency companies. So watch for that, and we'll definitely be working with the organizers on this. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed a great audience.